Aloha everyone and welcome back to our afternoon sessions. My name is Elena Huffine and I'm the moderator for this session titled DOT-HWYS Stormwater Post-Construction BMP Manual Revisions for HWY-O and HWY-M. Please use the Q&A section during the session to ask any questions you may have. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a few minutes for the speakers to answer your questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this session. Chun is the Engineering Program Manager for the Design Branch of the State of Hawaii Department of Transportation Highways Division. Jason Lau is a principal at the Limtiako Consulting Group, where he has been working for the last 22 years. His experience includes civil site design, sewer, water, and drainage systems, and temporary and permanent BMPs. Jon Lowry is a water resources engineer at Enviro Services and Training Center, LLC. Since 2013, Jon has provided support to the State of Hawaii Department of Transportation Highways Division, Oahu District, in implementing their stormwater management program plan, including the post-construction BMPs program. So please help me in welcoming Chun, Jason Lau, and Jon Lowry. Good afternoon.
Hi, thanks, Elena. So yeah, I'm just gonna kick things off here. So one thing, first off, I wanna help everybody switch gears because I know this conference in general is about construction and construction BMPs. And a very important distinction about this session is that we're talking about post-construction BMPs. Okay, next slide, please. And as opposed to, I'll just say that the reason we included this section, even though it's post-construction BMPs, is because it's just timely with the rewrite of the post-construction BMP manual. And so we just wanted to give people an opportunity to see that this manual is coming down the line. We'll get into a little more about when it's going to be actually available and implemented, but we just wanted to make sure that designers and design reviewers were aware that it is being revised. So first of all, so as opposed to construction BMPs, which are only used typically during construction activities and they're temporary BMPs, post-construction BMPs are either practices or devices that are installed that are meant to stay in place after the project is complete. And they provide long-term stormwater treatment. And particularly the focus that we're trying to get implemented the most are low impact development BMPs. And these are like bioswales, grass swales, anything that tries to maintain the pre-existing site conditions. So we'll get into a little more detail about that as well as we move on. For now though, I'm gonna pass it on to Karen to give us a little bit more of an introduction to this the whole reason that we're doing this manual rewrite and where we're at with it to date. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Jon. Good afternoon, everybody. I am with the State Department of Transportation, as Elena said, with the Highways Design Branch. My branch is responsible to assist with this permanent BMPs, and we're going to go over why. So the permanent BMPs manual is to establish procedures and guidelines for what happens post-construction, as Jon said before, and how do we implement this throughout our design projects. It's going to involve not just our highway design projects, but it's anything that affects our right-of-way. So even those individuals that come in under a private job as well. When is this manual going to be done? We're hoping to complete it by the end of this month and implement it sometime in the next year. And our staff, including myself, will be conducting training for it more extensive than what we're doing here as an introductory to it, for how are we implementing what are the new procedures coming out of this revised manual. The how we want to implement. So we want designers and the reviewers of design to be able to comply with the new criteria. And Jon and Jason are going to go into more detail what that means for your different projects that you're doing. What this will do for us is give us changes and hopefully more clarity on how to implement what is a permanent BMP, how to separate it from your construction BMPs, what's covered, what's not, when it involves coverage with MPDS, when it doesn't. Different islands will have different criteria as well. And they'll go over more detail than my talk. The other thing we want to do is revise our evaluation process to determine when a project qualifies to implement these permanent BMPs. And they'll, again, go into more detail later. And the last thing we want to offer is an alternative compliance process if we cannot implement what we want to do, and it is required under post-construction BMPs. Next slide. So this is our draft cover sheet of the new manual that we're working on doing. The revised manual will be available for electronic download sometime in January 2022 at the following website you see on here. Next slide. So this is just a teaser of what's going to be inside that manual and the different sections we have. So the first chapter will be a background, similar to what we told you today. Second chapter is going to be our stormwater post-construction best management practices. The third chapter will be the criteria for MS4 permit areas. The fourth chapter will be our criteria for non-MS4 permit areas. The fifth chapter will be exemptions and variances to our procedures and policies. The sixth chapter will be alternate compliance that could potentially be available if you cannot meet the requirements of the post BMPs. Seventh is our post-construction BMP design methodology. The eighth chapter will be the post-construction BMP development in the planning phase. The ninth chapter is the post-construction BMP development in the design phase. And finally, the last chapter is how do we do inspections, operation, and maintenance of these post-construction BMPs. Now I'd like to turn it back over to Jon so he can give you more details of what we're talking about. Thank you.
Thanks. Next slide, please. So yeah, I'm just going to briefly get into what sort of BMPs are we talking about here. So we already discussed we're not talking about construction BMPs. We're talking about BMPs that are more meant to be in place permanently. Sometimes the word permanent has been used in place of post-construction. We use those two terms synonymously here. But another, source control is kind of a first line of defense. I know you talk about that sometimes in construction, and even for in a post-construction concept, you could do source control BMPs that basically keep stormwater from getting contaminated. And that's still something we encourage. But mostly what we're talking about when we're talking about post-construction BMPs and the type of guidance that the manual provides is for treatment control BMPs. And our first priority is always going to be to use LID treatment control BMPs. And Jason will get into some more specifics about the design elements that go into these in later chapters. But just for example, some LID treatment control BMPs are either grass swales or bioswales. So it could be just an area where stormwater, instead of running into a concrete channel or straight into a storm drain, it goes into a grass swale and filters out and slows the velocity down prior to entering the storm drain or entering the MS4. The next slide, please. Another example is like a treatment train, like a stormwater detention pond. Stormwater detention ponds can sometimes be classified as LID, sometimes not. Kind of depends on the design that goes into it. Some of these systems have under drain systems that actually filter out the pollutants of concern. We usually try to target. And next slide, please. Those are kind of our LID treatments. Non-LID, which in the highway environment where we're dealing with narrow right-of-ways and limited availability for some of these LID post-construction BMPs, we have found it necessary to use some of these proprietary systems. So these are a few examples of underground vaults that take up a lot less space per volume of treatment that they can provide. So on the top left there, that is a nutrient separating baffle box. The lower left is it's just a filtration system. Basically, it has an upflow media filter, and those can be used in conjunction with the baffle box. We have quite a few CDS units. That's the device on the right there. Those tend to be able to fit in a small footprint and treat a pretty large area. Next slide, please. And then some smaller scale non-LID treatments. A lot of the freeways are elevated on viaducts, especially through the Honolulu downtown area. And so we have a lot of downspout filters. So one of the ways we've been treating those is on the upper left there, we have a downspout filter box, where basically we just built a concrete box to catch the water and then have this filter screen that allows the sediment and trash to settle out before it goes through the overflow. And then on the right, that is a curb inlet screen guard. And we've been putting a lot of those in, put some in over on the windward side and in areas where we're expecting high trash. Those are helping us with compliance with our trash and also considered a non-LID treatment control BMP. Okay, next slide, please. So let's get into some of the changes from last year's manual. First of all, we're calling projects either public or private construction projects. This is new terminology. In the past, a public construction project would have been called a contract construction project. Public construction project, we're just adding that definition to provide a little more clarity. And this is also a definition that's changing throughout the stormwater management program. So it's basically any project that's funded by DOT-HWYS and designed by personnel of DOT-HWYS or engineering consulting firm, which was hired by DOT, and either constructed by DOT or a private contractor. But generally, these are going to be within DOT's right-of-way and done on behalf of DOT-HWYS or by them directly. Private construction projects, which would have in the past been referred to as encroachment projects, are projects that are not under the authority or funding of DOT-HWYS, and they're located usually outside of the right-of-way, but they typically require some sort of permit or connection to DOT-HWYS MS4 or water even just flowing into the right-of-way. It also could include City and County of Honolulu projects, but typically if it's City and County of Honolulu is undertaking a project, they're going to comply with their own stormwater regulations, which would cover them, and which is something we'll get to momentarily. But again, yeah, so those are two new terms to be aware of. No longer contract project, it's called public construction project, and no longer encroachment, but private construction project. Okay, next slide, please. So here's one of the larger changes to be aware of. This is a criteria specifically for MS4 permit areas. And I'll back up just a bit. There are areas on Oahu, all of Oahu and City and County of and the areas basically, island-wide on Oahu are covered by an MS4 and PDS permit. The areas there are the more urban areas of Maui that are covered by an MS4 and PDS permit, but for the purpose of this manual criteria, the entire island of Maui is included. And so all projects in these two areas that result in 1 acre or more of disturbed area are required to implement LID permanent BMPs. In the past, that threshold was 1 acre of new impervious surface. So we've now backed up to even if you're not adding a whole new acre of impervious, but you do disturb an acre of land, you are required to implement LID BMPs. And then furthermore, if it's a priority project, something like maybe a refueling station or a parking lot, those, even if they are under an acre of disturbance, at DOT's discretion, they could require post-construction BMPs. And it's important, real quick, since we are talking about post-construction versus construction. I know in construction BMPs, the definition of disturbance can include areas where you're just staging equipment. Maybe it's a paved parking lot, but the fact that you're using it as a staging area, that has to count into your disturbance. For these post-construction BMPs, that's not the case. we're only talking about disturbed areas being activity that results in the penetration, turning, or moving of soil, including roadway construction, demolition, grading, grubbing, reconstruction of pavement, which exposes the underlying base course. So that's, if you're just doing a grind and overlay, you're not considered disturbing unless you get all the way down to base course. Okay, next slide, please. So now for private construction projects in MS4 permit areas, so these are the projects that are generally going to be out of the right of way, but just connect to DOT's right of way and require some sort of connection or discharge permit. They are required, regardless of the size of the project, if the project has the potential to discharge stormwater runoff to DOT highways right of way. And the good thing about private projects, I guess for the DOT side, is that if you're in an MS4 permit area, either on Oahu or Maui, you're most likely going to trigger, almost like 99% of the time, you're going to trigger the city and county's requirements. So if you trigger the city and county's stormwater requirements and you comply with their requirements, all you have to do to comply with DOT is submit that report showing that it's been approved by city and county. And we will consider that being in compliance with DOT's stormwater requirements. Okay, next slide, please. So criteria for public construction projects in non-MS4. So now we're talking about Big Island and Kauai, areas that don't have an MS4 and PDS permit. And for the most part, you can just go back to the previous manual, and we haven't changed much of what the requirements are from the previous. The previous manual didn't distinguish between MS4 and non-MS4 permit areas, but the new manual does. So for those non-MS4 areas, it's just 1 acre of new impervious surface that triggers the implementation of LIDs and or non-LID BMPs. And then again, it's always at the DOT reviewer's discretion if the site has a high potential for pollutant discharge, that they can require them, even if it doesn't add a new acre of impervious. And so just, yeah, quick definition of impervious surface. Surface area which allows little or no infiltration, such as asphalt and concrete, pavements, bridge decks, sidewalks, walkways, concrete slabs, and roofs. Next slide, please. So criteria for private construction projects in non-MS4 permit areas. So basically, they're only required for private construction projects if 1 acre or more of new impervious surface is created within the DOT highways right of way. If you're in a non-MS4 permit area and you're doing a private project completely out of DOT highways right of way, it's only encouraged, not required, that you implement post-construction BMPs. Okay, next slide, please. And real quick, I'm gonna talk about some exemptions and variances. Not all projects are subject to these rules. And these exemptions and variances are kind of general. You can't necessarily say these activities would always be exempt, but in general, these types of activities like operations and maintenance activities, like structural repairs, so like repairs on a building or structure rather than something that disturbs the soil, base yard maintenance and repairs, installation or replacement of pavement striping and pavement markers, and then pavement preservation treatments like grind and overlay resurfacing, restoration, rehabilitation projects that are confined to the impervious layers. So we're not actually grinding all the way down and getting to the base course. And then guardrail and utility projects, guardrail installation or replacement, utility installation or relocation. Those projects that are usually just a linear trench down the center of the roadway, those are usually exempt. Next slide. And then a couple more water quality improvement or preservation projects. So like shoreline protection, landscaping, projects that are meant to improve the environment or preserve or reduce erosion, typically exempted. Minor disturbance projects, like if you're just putting in signage or ADA ramps, bridge or road constructed above an existing impervious area, like some of the viaducts, pedestrian walkways, emergency projects, temporary projects. And then An important distinction also is that projects that are currently in the design phase, in which timing and scheduling of the project for advertising may make it infeasible to comply with this revised manual. So we know that when this manual is implemented sometime in 2022, that there'll be projects that are well underway in design, and we're not going to expect those projects to go back and redesign from a new manual requirement. There will be an exemption for projects that are past a certain phase. And then also federal aid, city and county projects. And so that's all I've got. Jason Lau with Limtiaco Consulting Group is going to get us into the nitty gritty of how we're actually going to use this manual and some of the more details about how to design some of these post-construction BMPs.
Let me share my screen. I'll be covering the second half of the presentation. And these are the topics I'll be covering. So as Karen mentioned, I'm also going to be giving a real quick overview of Appendix A to the manual, which includes the post-construction treatment control BMP fact sheets. Now, most of Oahu and parts of Maui can be characterized as having ultra-urban highways, which are areas with limited right-of-way, high traffic volumes, high amounts of impervious surfaces. You know, everything you see in this picture here, you know, it has compacted soils, which results in limited infiltration. And if you can imagine trying to put in a post-construction BMP in this corridor, you know, whether it's a bioswale or infiltration basin, is very, very difficult. And if you compare that to, say, like a site development project for the city and county, if you have a library or office building, the developer has the option of adjusting the footprint size or moving the buildings around on the site to make room for BMPs. But DOT rarely has that flexibility, and yet they're still required to meet compliance with the MS4 permit. So we're going to be introducing a new strategy for the revised manual. This is going to be the alternative compliance program, and this allows for water quality treatment.
Jason, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, we can't see your screen yet.
Oh.
There we go.
Okay.
Yep, we can see it now.
Sorry about that. So the new strategy that's going to be implemented is this alternative compliance.
But I don't think we're seeing the correct presentation. We're seeing, it says, it looks like a template.
Okay. Let me try this again.
There we go. Looked like you were challenging us to a chess match for a minute there.
Does that work right there? How's that?
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. No matter how many times you practice the Zoom thing, right, there's always something that could go wrong. So alternative compliance, so a new strategy that's going to be included in this revised manual, and that allows for additional water quality treatment to be provided in an alternative watershed. And it's allowed when the designer can document and prove that post-construction BMPs cannot adequately treat the full required treatment area. And if DOT agrees with the designer, then an alternative watershed will be identified in which to provide the deficit amount of water quality treatment. And so there's several benefits to the alternative compliance program. And like I said, you know, flexibility is one of them. It allows DOT to address water quality treatment in another watershed. And then by doing so, you know, any watershed that has been identified as being impaired, they can focus more treatment into that watershed and provide mitigation at a faster rate. And also you can realize, hope to expect some economies of scale So if you have, for example, 5 projects that have half an acre that requires treatment, possibility of DOT combining that into just one project and one single treatment device, which would hopefully, have some savings realized for design fees as well as construction costs, and definitely maintenance. Maintenance of one BMP is probably a lot cheaper than doing 5 separate ones. So alternative compliance program, how will it work? If you have a project that has been identified as requiring post-construction BMPs, you start on the upper left corner of your screen. The top priority, first of all, is you always try to install LIDs. And if you can treat the required treatment area, then your project fulfills the post-construction BMP requirements. If not, you can option to install non-LIDs. And if that can treat the required treatment, you're fine. If the designer cannot meet the required treatment through LIDs and non-LIDs, then they will have to prepare and submit a variance request form and submit that to DOT-HWYS. Okay, so there's 3 possible outcomes that can occur. So the first outcome is that DOT-HWYS will look at what the designer provided, and they'll agree that although they did not meet the minimum required treatment area, that they fulfill the intent of the program. Okay, so that your project is okay and no further post-construction BMPs are required. The second outcome is that DOT will look at the project and say, no, I think you can probably provide a bit more treatment, either maybe look at a different type of BMP. So go back to the drawing board and try again. And the third option is, maybe you have a difficult site, you have high groundwater, poor clay soils, or if you have a lot of steep slopes on there, and you do not meet the required treatment area, then they say, well, we can, definitely want to meet it somewhere. We'll define another alternative watershed, and we'll implement this alternative compliance program. Okay, so some of the guidelines for this program, it's going to be allowed for public construction projects only. And once again, this is mainly for projects funded by DOT-HWYS within DOT-HWYS right-of-way. And the reason for this is because DOT has limited, if any, jurisdiction over private projects that occur outside of the right-of-way. Okay, so it's only for public construction projects only. And then DOT-HWYS will identify an alternative watershed in which to address the extra treatment. And if alternative compliance is implemented, it will be addressed in a totally separate project. So the first project that is, can't meet it, they're going to be relieved of providing any further post-construction BMP requirements. And the reason for this is because, to identify a new watershed and then to get topography, topo surveys and do due diligence, it's going to take a while. So we definitely don't want to hold up that first project. So it's going to be handled in a totally separate project. And then credits and debits will be tracked on a project basis as well as on a watershed basis. Okay, in order to track it, there's going to be a credit tracking program, and it's going to be measured in units of treatment area. So projects that treat more than what is required will generate a credit, and then projects that treat less than what is required will generate a debit. And then projects that have more debits than credits will need to submit a variance request form. Okay, and so some examples of how credits can be created, right? So if you treat more than what's required, you'll get a credit. If you have a reduction of impervious surface area, say for example, if you have an existing road and you replace that with a grassed area, you'll get a credit. Or if you have an existing catch basin and you install a tree box filter, you'll get a credit for that as well. Debits can be created if you have more new impervious surfaces, or if you take away existing BMPs. For example, if you had an existing vegetated swale next to your road, but you remove that to install a new shoulder lane, then you'll lose the amount of treatment area that that swale provided. So the impervious surfaces, it does have a large impact on the amount of runoff and pollutants that enter the MS4. And a lot of the DOTs on the mainland, they've been focusing more on impervious surfaces, treating impervious surfaces. And so the revised manual is going to follow that same approach. Okay, so sizing these post-construction BMPs is based upon the new development and the redevelopment that's included within your project. And new development is defined as any new impervious surface intended for vehicular use. Okay, so the last part of that sentence for vehicular use is important, because we have, if you have a bike path or a walkway intended for pedestrians, those are considered non-pollutant generators. So those are excluded from the non-development area. And so non-development area is just for vehicles. So it includes, roads, intersections, parking lots, base yards. And redevelopment is any activity that occurs on existing impervious surfaces in which the underlying treatment, aggregate, or pervious subgrade is exposed or penetrated. So it follows basically the same definition as disturbance that Jon provided earlier. So it does not include pavement preservation treatments such as overlays, cold planing, and resurfacing. And then the way to compute what your required treatment area is with this formula. And so it's based on your new development as well as redevelopment. And if you notice, there's also this F variable, which is the redevelopment treatment fraction. And what that is if you consider a pervious area and you build a new road, I mean, the impact to the MS4 is the big difference between the pre-development and the post-development conditions. So you're required to treat the entire impervious area. And for redevelopment areas on existing impervious, because the road is already there, there's not as much of an impact to the MS4. So there is a little bit of credit. And that 25% credit, or 25% of redevelopment, is required for treatment for MS4 permit areas. And for non-MS4 permit areas, they typically have less funding, maybe less resources. So they're only required to treat the new development area, which is the new impervious surface area. And you also get some credit for any areas treated by existing BMPs. Okay, so we have a little example to help clarify things. Okay, so the first step is to determine whether post-construction BMPs are required. Okay, so you have an existing condition, the 4-lane paved road on Oahu, which is an MS4 permit area. The existing impervious area is 4 acres. The existing vegetated swale treats 1 acre. And the proposed condition is to install 2 new lanes. You have 1 existing lane to be reconstructed, which is 1 acre. And then you'll also be disturbing 1 acre of pervious surface. Okay, so the criteria is for all public construction projects that result in 1 acre or more of disturbed area are required to implement LIDs. Okay, so for this example, 4 acres disturbed, so LID BMPs are required. And the next question is, okay, well, how much treatment is required? Okay, so we have this equation down below. And as my high school teacher used to always say, plug and chug. So new development, you have 2 acres, which are 2 new lanes constructed. You have your redevelopment of 1 lane reconstructed, that's 1 acre. And because we're located in an MS4 permit area, your redevelopment treatment fraction is 25%. And then you get to subtract that 1 acre of treatment from that existing swale. So your area requiring treatment for this problem is 1.25 acres. Okay, so this part didn't change. Treatment control BMPs. You have volume-based BMPs, which rely on retention and storage of runoff, and pollutants are removed through sedimentation and infiltration. Flow-based BMPs, in which pollutants are removed as they pass through the BMP, such as buffer strips, vegetated swales. These are also described in more detail in the revised manual. And the sizing, so this equation is the same. So for volume-based BMPs, the water quality volume uses the same equation. It has that 1-inch design storm, which is based on the 85th percentile storm. Okay, equation is the same. The only difference is, because now that we're focusing only on impervious surfaces, this actual treatment area is a lot less. Okay, but to offset that, because it is impervious surfaces, the volumetric runoff coefficient is a lot higher. So for impervious surfaces, that C factor is going to be 0.95. Okay, so the treatment area is smaller, but your C factor is higher. And similarly for flow-based BMPs, to compute your water quality flow rate, the equation is the same. It has the rainfall intensity of 0.4 inches per hour. But once again, because we're focusing on impervious surfaces, your treatment area is smaller, but you're going to be using a higher runoff coefficient. Okay, and some of the changes that were made in the planning phase. So a separate post-construction BMP is no longer required. A post-construction BMP planning report is no longer required. If the project does require a planning report, an environmental assessment, or an EIS, your preliminary post-construction BMP information should be provided there. Otherwise, it'll be deferred into the design phase, in which you'll be preparing a BMP post-construction BMP design report. So some of the contents of your planning report are shown on the right-hand side. And summary of changes for the design phase. So what we do, we try to make it consistent with the city and county's manual, because we know a lot of you are familiar with that. And so a lot of the terminology, we try to keep the same, and to minimize confusion for designers and contractors. So we borrowed some of the infiltration test requirements from that manual. We kept it the same in terms of number of tests per square area or per linear feet. We kept those requirements the same. We also introduced these minimum technological verification requirements for proprietary treatment devices. And so there's a lot of products that come on the market. And as long as they are tested and verified by one of these programs, such as NJCAT or the TAPE program, they're open to consideration by DOT. And we definitely don't want to limit designers from using just what is in this manual. There's also going to be some post-construction BMP design checklists included. Now, the current manual does have a checklist. It's what we decided to do was create a separate one for MS4 permit areas, and also a separate one for non-MS4 permit areas, because they do have different criteria now. Okay, and these are to be submitted for each project, regardless of whether post-construction BMPs are required or not. Okay, and they're to be submitted during the preliminary design phase, and then updated and resubmitted if there's any changes to the BMP designs. And also new to the manual is this BMP variance request form, which is required for projects that do not meet the required treatment area. Okay, so all of these forms are mainly for documentation, so that we can go back and look at what projects required BMPs and whether they met the BMPs. And it's just a good way to track for program compliance. Okay, and then lastly, Appendix A, which will include the treatment control BMP fact sheets. These are just an updated toolbox for treatment control BMPs. And these are common to Hawaii and maybe applicable to Hawaii's climate and environment. And we updated some of the BMP summary tables. We simplified it a bit to only include typical targeted pollutants and some other factors such as typical maintenance costs, construction costs. We also revised the fact sheets to provide more detailed sizing guidelines and design criteria. And these are in line with some of the practices that are currently being followed on the mainland. Hawaii a lot of times follows what is done in California, Maryland, and so we took some of our cues from those updated manuals as well. And then we also updated some of the manufactured treatment devices, such as hydrodynamic separators, drain inserts, and provided more information there, as well as updating some of the photos and diagrams. Okay, and as John and Karen mentioned, we plan to have a separate worksheet workshop. And at that workshop, we'll be providing a little bit more detail about how to size these BMPs and a little bit more detail on how to go through the process of deciding when they're required and how to size them. Okay, so with that, we can open it up to any questions.
All right, yeah, thank you, Karen, Jason, and John for your presentations. So we are now going to open it up for question and answer portion of the session. If anyone has any questions, please type them in the Q&A section at this time, which is at the bottom of your screen. No questions yet. We did have a question earlier on someone asked if we could get a copy of the PowerPoint. So I mentioned the PowerPoint's not available for download, but the recorded session of the presentation will be available for viewing for 30 days after the session. And then you can also view any past presentations at our stormwaterhawaii.com YouTube channel.
Jason, I have one. In your presentation, you showed that checklist for preliminary design phase. Could you clarify for everyone if that's for all projects, whether it be public or private?
Yeah, it's going to be for all projects, whether they're public or private, and then whether they do need post-construction BMPs or not. So all projects to be reviewed by DOT should submit that checklist.
Okay, looks like we have a few more questions. Do encroachment projects have to comply with the 1 acre disturbance threshold?
I will take that. So first of all, yeah, by encroachment, the new terminology for that, again, just as a reminder, will be a private project, private construction project. And if it is in an MS4 permit area, so basically on the island of Oahu or Maui, it will have the 1 acre of disturbance threshold. But in addition, DOT can require those encroachment projects. In general, they require them to not have any new additional discharge. So even if it's a smaller project during the review phase, you're generally going to have to be required to provide some treatment. And then thirdly, that's also a scenario where you're most likely going to be kicked into compliance with the city and county on either Oahu or Maui, and you're going to be subject to their requirements. And most likely you're going to be submitting a report to them, which you provide to us as proof that you complied.
All right, next question. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more. Who will be tracking all these future requirements of credits and debts?
I think that's probably something that we will provide more detail on in the all-day training session that we're going to have in the spring. I don't think we want to try to get to that at this time.
All right, and 1 more question. Sorry, my dog's drinking in the background. Are there any types of green infrastructures you might consider implementing for future projects?
Got any ideas, Jason?
So in the BMP fact sheets, we do include bower retention, and we have vegetated swales and things like that. Rain harvesting. There's a lot of different options. But like we mentioned, don't be limited by what's included in the manual. Designer is free to propose any type of green infrastructure or any type of BMP that they think best fits their situation.
Yeah, we would like the designers to get creative and start using these technologies and not just sort of kick it back and say it's not possible. because we'd like you to come up with the solutions, and DOT will definitely kick it back to you if they feel like you haven't been creative enough in trying to implement some post-construction BMPs, especially LID BMPs.
All right, so we did have a few more questions that we'll have to address after this session. Sorry, everyone. But thank you again for your presentations, Karen, Jason, and John. That now concludes this session. Thank you all for attending. The next sessions begin at 2 p.m. Please return to the sessions tab to see the next breakout sessions. And don't forget to stop by the networking lounge to talk with other attendees and check the leaderboard to see if you're in the lead. There's still a lot of time to earn points. Thank you all.